I want to welcome everyone to this conversation. It's obviously very timely. We've had a lot of challenging events happen over the course of the last week or two, and it deserves a challenging conversation. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We are discussing race and injustice in architecture, and we're incredibly grateful to today's panelists for joining us to lend their perspective to the conversation. What we're going to do is we're going to begin with a discussion among our three panelists and then open it up for Q&A and discussion with the audience. And I'm really proud to say, since we started doing these in March, this is the largest conversation we've had amongst our membership about this topic, well, about any topic for that matter. So that is extremely gratifying to know that the interest is there amongst our membership and the profession to have this conversation. Now, our intention is for this to be a safe place to talk about a dangerous topic. If you're here to listen, to ask questions that help you understand, to grieve, to increase empathy for the marginalized and victimized, we welcome you to this dialogue. If you're here to dismiss, to compare, to argue, or justify yourself, this is not the time or place for that. We're here to address racial injustice and its existence in society, the built environment, and the profession. If you do not start by acknowledging it exists in each of those arenas, you cannot be an ally in eradication. And that is our ultimate goal. And that is who I think is on the call today to help us accomplish that. So with that said, and those ground rules in place, we'd like to invite you to use the Q&A function in today's presentation if you have questions for our speakers. It is a dialogue. It is meant to be interactive and engaging. After our initial discussion, we will use these questions to continue the conversation. We also have the option, if you'd like to join the discussion live, to use the raise your hand feature and via Zoom, and that will enable us to turn on your video and microphone to ask the question directly. So today, with all that prologue, I'm sure you want to know who is joining us. And we have three lovely and accomplished people. And we'll start with a quick bio, and this is the order they'll go in to give their presentations and tell a little bit about their story. And I want to say personally, thanks for sharing time with us. I'm sure you have many other things you could be doing, and it's not an easy conversation. It's something that you've lived and felt your whole lives that many of us are only now becoming more aware of. So we appreciate you bringing us into your perspective. Okay, so ANNICIA STREETE. Hi, ANNICIA.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
ANNICIA, sorry about that. ANNICIA STREETE is an architecture and construction practitioner at Catena Construction and Sprocket Design+Planning. In addition to practice, she is also an adjunct faculty member of the College of Architecture and Planning at the University of Colorado, Denver, where she instructs in design studio and building technology courses. She's also the co-vice president for the Colorado chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects, or NOMA. Next, we have FLORY HAMSTRA. Hi, FLORY.
Hello.
FLORY is an architectural designer in the city of Denver who currently works for the commercial architecture and planning group, NAOS Design Group. FLORY has led and organized numerous committees and events during her career to promote community engagement, holistic design practices, and multicultural advancement. She is also co-president-elect of the Colorado chapter of NOMA. And finally, we have Larry Sykes. Larry is a Colorado registered architect and owner of Sykes Projects. His 14-year career in architecture includes leading single-family, multifamily, and commercial projects. Larry is born and raised in the Denver metro area, and he is co-chair of AIA Colorado's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusiveness Committee, and a member of the Denver Public Art Committee, and was a big instigator in making sure this conversation happened today and got the panelists that we have. So hi, Larry, and thank you for joining us again. Okay, with that, I will let you guys take it away, starting with ANNICIA.
Okay. I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today for such a time as this. We've all been, exposed to what's been happening in the last few days, few weeks, few months, few years, really. And I say that to sort of bring attention to the fact that, these discussions that we're having now are very much appreciated, but they need to be sort of taken into consideration from the point of view of the group that we're calling attention to, right? We're looking at how the Black community is being affected here. But do understand there are some other narratives that also play into this. So I just wanted to, sort of start by saying this is a very appreciative of being able to have this platform today. So just to give a little bit more about my background, I'm originally from the Caribbean. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, which is located in the Southern Caribbean. My beginning into architecture, started back there, but I wanted the opportunity to further my education, further my career. In terms of becoming a designer and practitioner in the field. So I migrated to the United States and I started in the engineering field, acquired my degree, undergraduate degree in civil and environmental engineering with an emphasis in structures, and then moved to Colorado to pursue my master's in architecture. All in the search of, a dream and opportunity and a desire to have a positive effect on myself, my family, my community. And so in terms of moving here and acquiring my degree, I, finished here at the University of Colorado, started working in the field, was practicing for a few years, and also started teaching. My love for teaching, I saw that as no different than the effect that I wanted to make in architecture, but I had a real special place in my heart for passing on knowledge to my students. It didn't matter what race or creed or religion or anything like that. But I really had a passion for passing on that knowledge. I think one just sort of last brief sort of intro thing I'd like to say, in terms of being someone who's an immigrant who came from another country, it was important to be able to see representation of all kinds, but especially my kind too. Representation is so important in sort of giving you that, sort of extra understanding of support that's there. So I'm hoping, that topic will come up again and I can elaborate a little bit more on that. But that's a little bit more about my background, and I will pass it off to FLORY next.
Thank you so much, ANNICIA. So I also wanted to start off by saying thank you to everybody that put this together, and everybody that's listening, and everybody that cares about this actually being a conversation and making some changes. What I hope to see come out of this is some action. I want us to come out with some action items that will hopefully get implemented. We won't solve it all today or this month or maybe in the next year. It'll take probably decades. But we can start today with some small steps. A little bit more about me is I am from the Dominican Republic and from Puerto Rico. So I bring the Afro-Latina perspective to the conversation, and came to the US when I was 12 and learned the language and just fell in love with Colorado, and went to the Art Institute for interior design originally. Then I attended the University of Colorado, like many of us, for the Masters of Architecture. And I've been in the industry for about 7 years now. And I just love it. There's been some good experiences. There's been some painful experiences, which I think is the experience for everybody on this panel today. But overall, very passionate about this industry. And that's why I'm here today, so that I can do my part to make it even better.
Thank you, FLORY. My name is Larry Sykes, and thank you also to everybody for joining today. I specifically am the co-chair of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusiveness Committee. So this is a topic that, you know, we've been really grappling with for, you know, the history of that committee, which I'll get into a little bit more later. But, you know, I think this is the first time that I have seen the architecture community really want to engage with the topic of racial equity to this degree before. And so I'm really excited about moving forward with that. And I think that it's a really a watershed moment in this field and obviously in our entire society. A little bit about myself. I'm from the Denver area. I was born in Aurora, and I'm biracial. My father is Black, my mother is white, and my dad grew up in housing projects in St. Louis and in Denver. So, you know, I'm a kind of huge nerd about modernist architecture, but I'm also kind of aware of the, you know, some of the less like fun aspects of modernist architecture, and also the sort of particularly like racialized aspects of kind of architecture and development throughout the 20th century in the United States. So hopefully we can get into that a little bit today.
Thanks, guys, for telling us more about yourselves. And now we're going to get into some of the nitty gritty. I want to start with you, Larry, if we could, because you obviously have a leadership role in taking these conversations forward, and you have been for a while. So the EDI committee, for those who aren't aware, we were one of the first chapters in AIA to set one of these up, and it's a really strong group. Can you tell people more about what they've been working on and what they're hoping to do, and who has been part of those conversations?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. So, we began in Colorado our EDI efforts as the Colorado chapter in 2018 with the task force. I wasn't personally involved with that, but that task force pretty quickly ramped up and got some EDI content into the 2018 Practice and Design Conference, which was how I became aware of that work and joined in. So yeah, I think, you know, that's one of the really big things that we've been doing is bringing programming to the Practice and Design Conference, including national speakers like Michael Ford from Hip Hop Architecture, and Rosa Shang, who is one of the leading voices on equity in architecture in the country, having meetups and peer group conversations that have been really fruitful for people to share their experiences and what their hopes are. At the beginning of this year, we had an unconscious bias training for committee volunteers with the AIA. We have a really robust group that's doing work on the education pipeline, collaborating with the local architecture schools and with programs like Box City and Cal. We have had some of our members speaking at the Business of Architecture series, at the Christopher Kelly Leadership Development Program, about equity and why it's important, you know, both from a kind of social standpoint, but also from a business standpoint, that it's good business to incorporate equity, diversity, and inclusion into how your firm runs and its culture. And then this year we have begun some really robust cross-committee engagement across the different AIA committees to try and get EDI really as the sort of operating procedure of how all the committees work.
I think that's an important point, is that it's not a silo to operate in by itself. You know, EDI is not a standalone initiative or a one-off. And when it is infused throughout your organization, your membership, and the firms that make up the AIA, that's when you are achieving success, not when you sort of say, we'll park you over here and let you guys talk about this and play in your sandbox. And maybe if you come up with a good idea or two, we'll think about it. So that's the challenge organizationally for us, is to make sure that it is something that cross collaborates. I'm so happy that you guys are starting a NOMA chapter. I don't think there's a huge awareness of the history and the legacy of what this organization is. As a very young executive in Illinois, I was invited to the funeral service for Wendell Campbell, and he was the first president of NOMA. It started at an AIA convention in Detroit, I believe. But what an organization to have in the profession, and to now have a more real presence here in Colorado. Can you talk about your co-presidency and your sort of founding of this chapter here in Colorado? Why did you decide to take that on?
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, I will be acting as the co-president-elect, which means that I will be a future president. And right now I am sharing that seat with Patricia Joseph from Cunningham Group. Her and I founded the chapter together, and we recruited our executive committee, ANNICIA as our VP. The reasons that we wanted to start this chapter came from simply wanting to belong. You know, it just boils down to that. So I had just had a very confusing and just negative experience in my career. And for the first time, I felt marginalized. I felt excluded. I felt like I needed answers. I needed to find a group where I felt like they could lend me support and help me have some tools to deal with the sort of discrimination that I had experienced. So I didn't know a lot about it. So I wanted to educate myself. So I went online to see what groups I could join in Colorado for that sort of support, and to kind of like gain more understanding and how I could deal with this reality. And you know what? I didn't find any groups. We did. I know you guys, Larry, have your committee, and that's fantastic. However, it wasn't very visible right away for me. And I had heard about NOMA through another colleague, Casey Taylor, and I knew about it, but I saw that there wasn't a chapter in Colorado. So when I reached out to them, I said, hey, how can I join the national? How can I maybe join the closest chapter? They were like, well, you should just start one. And that was it. The rest is history. So that's what happened. It just came from wanting to belong and find people like me, and maybe people who had experienced something similar and that they could give me advice. So because we didn't have that, we created it so that now we have it, and that the younger generation coming up can have that in us.
Yeah. Careful what questions you ask. Right? It leads to, usually leads to,
I'm sorry?
Say careful what questions you ask, right?
Yes.
How can I join the closest organization? Well, you are the organization.
Yes. You are it, FLORY.
Yeah. What was your experience, ANNICIA, to want to start up the local NOMA chapter?
Yeah, and this is going to sort of circle back to my comment about representation that I made earlier on. You know, when I came here as a graduate student, coming from, now, first of all, I went to engineering school in South Dakota, and I don't think I have to, like, you know, spell out any sort of percentages really, but I was, you know, either, you know, the, you know, only Black student in my class, or, you know, there were other students that were, you know, international students, and we were all sort of coming here as minorities too. But in coming to Denver, I remember in my first semester here, again, I was it was one of two Black students, and the other person was a young lady. And also, in looking at the student body and also looking at the faculty representation, it was a very low percentage. And I remember thinking, that I appreciated even just the opportunity to pursue my education to this level, but what sort of support is out there? I had just learned of the AIA, but again, sometimes seeing someone who looks like you, just even that sort of simple understanding, puts a little bit of a confidence in you to sort of seek out their stories as well, to understand what things you might have had in common, what experiences you might have had in common or not. So I think in starting the chapter here, again, I think about that very first experience of mine and that question I asked myself, how many years ago, I'm not going to state how many years ago that was, but just having that representation that could act in, a support of similar backbone that, might be able to spread an even wider message in terms of, yes, you do belong here, and yes, you do have a place in the field. So that's sort of really a real driver for me in terms of, wanting to start the chapter with FLORY and Patricia.
And nobody has stated this question, but I've heard it before, why do you need your own separate group? And I think from our perspective, that's kind of a weird question, right? Because to my point of view, we don't see it as a competitive organization. We see it as a partner organization. It's not an instead of, it's an in addition to, because a lot of NOAA members are also AIA members. They don't have to be, but it's often the case. And
yep.
This happens within AIA all the time too, right? So we have knowledge communities, we have subcommittees, we have peer groups that want to talk about sustainability or healthcare architecture or residential design. So it's of akin to those things. It just happens to be a demographic based thing, which incidentally, so are emerging professionals. So I think we have to give some space and grace for those connections to take place and not sit in judgment of why do you need your own thing? All kinds of groups have their own thing within the architecture profession.
Exactly, Mike. And with that, I would like to add, the timing is so right. Being on the academic side too, I'm not sure if how well it's known, but there is also a student chapter of NOMA that actually was just previously formed and launched. We always joke, that the students beat us to it, but it was happening, sort of concurrently. And I'm so proud of them. They were able to, go ahead and get everything sort of finalized in terms of launching it. So now the College of Architecture and Planning also has a NOMA student chapter led by Xiomara Amara. I think she might be on the call today, but I just wanted to make sure and sort of publicize that. So to let you guys know, things are happening at a time when it's necessary, but I'm just sort of, like happy to be a part of it. And, we've even talked about, how we're even going to start to support and bolster each other, in this time.
Shout out to the students.
Yeah.
So, go ahead, Larry.
Oh yeah, just really quickly, I think one of the primary reasons why NOMA exists is because of the demographics. We have a very severe underrepresentation, particularly of African American architects, also Latino architects in the United States. I think the U.S. population of Black folks is like 13%, and there's about 2% of architects are Black, and for Black women, I mean, the numbers are just really dismal, like 0.2%. There was an Architect magazine cover with that statistic on it, just because it was so shocking years ago. And so, yeah, I mean, we have to really advocate for ourselves to really increase our voice and our representation in a way that other groups maybe don't necessarily have to do.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate fact that especially for the women on the panel today, you know your number, you know what number you are in the history of the architecture profession and people who have been licensed among your demographic group, right? You would never hear a white person say, oh, I'm number 156,243. But you know, African American women who are licensed can say, I'm number 400 something. You know, for a profession that's been around the same amount of time for all those demographics. So representation is certainly something that has to be addressed as we move forward. But I want to get a little bit more to that individual story. And you know, it's been said to me that if you don't see one, you don't know you can be one. And in traditionally African American communities, there aren't a lot of architects that get hired to work in those communities, for example. So you may not see one to know that you can aspire to that career path. So I'm curious, going way back to when you first had an inkling of, I'm interested in architecture, I want to be an architect, how did that seed get planted?
I can start. Mine started back in Trinidad and Tobago. In my family, my father and most of my uncles were involved in either the construction field, engineering field, and some type of a development field. My father used to take me, he would come pick me up after school when I was a very young child. So this started, in my very early years. And he would always have to stop by the job site. For every trip. I was 5 and I thought I had places to be, but he had to stop by the job site. And I remember simple things such as like digging in his tool bag, very curious child. And he said that all of these years, he didn't know that even a simple, 5-10 minutes stop by the job site would have such an impact on me. And it's very, we have this very nice relationship today where talking to him about issues in the field, he says, he looks at me and he said, a few years ago, I didn't even know that this was going to impact you. And now we're having these conversations on, some of the similar things too. So that was one aspect. And then my uncles, I remember I got my very first custom drafting board from an uncle who decided to build it for me after he saw me, which was unknown to me. I was reading through his blueprints. He said he wasn't sure I even understood what I was doing, but he decided to build me this custom drafting table, not even knowing what would come out of that. And that for me was the single moment where I realized, wow, he saw something. And the seed was essentially, this thing that he built for me that, they all sort of fostered from that time on. So that's what I'm saying. Sometimes that's why representation is so important. You just never know who might be, which student might be in your class that might have had, those questions or may not have had experiences like that. So I take that very seriously.
Annicia or Larry, how about for you?
So I'm sorry, did you say FLORY or Larry?
Oh, sorry, Annicia just, sorry, apologies.
Okay.
Annicia, thank you for sharing. FLORY or Larry, how about you?
So for me, it started when I was about 9 or 10. My parents were building their own home, their dream home in Puerto Rico. And we were at the job site, like Annicia said, every day. It was amazing seeing this construction. And I was fascinated by this concept of like the blueprints, and I would read through them too. And I was just like, oh my goodness, so they draw it and then it happens. And, I was just very fascinated. And my mom would help me read through the blueprints. And then she told me the story that when she was a young girl and she graduated high school, her dream was to be an architect or a structural engineer. And she wasn't allowed to do so. Back in Dominican Republic, it was a very traditional, her town and her parents were very traditional, very religious. So unfortunately, they felt that that was too secular. She would be, lost with the, unbelievers if she became an architect. So she, unfortunately, she wasn't able to realize this dream of hers. And so I always had that in the back of my mind. And then in high school, right before I graduated, my counselor, we did aptitude tests, and my counselor said to me, you tested very high on engineering, but we see that you're an artist, so we recommend architecture. So it all kind of came together. And I told my parents I'm going to go to architecture school. I was very young. I was 16 when I graduated high school. I skipped a grade. And my father was very concerned, you know, traditional Hispanic male. And he was very concerned. He was like, my sweet, sweet, creative little FLORY, they're going to eat you alive. Don't do it. And so he was just trying to protect me, but he kept it real. He's like, architecture is dominated by these types of people. He explained it very clearly. He was like, you will probably not be able to have a chance to like thrive. And he was like, go to interior design school. It'll be better. And so I was like, yes, Daddy. And so then I went to interior design school at the Art Institute, loved it, learned a lot. I just adored it. However, I excelled on the architecture classes. I excelled on the AutoCAD classes. And my advisor, once again, was like, you should move forward to go into architecture, which is clearly your passion. So, you know, after I graduated from the Art Institute and I practiced interior design for a little bit, I loved it, but I was just like, I want more. And even though the odds are against me, I didn't care. I was like, I am just fascinated by this field, and I'm going to do it for me and for my mother and for all of those, you know, little girls that have not been able to, that have been too scared to do it, that their dads say they're going to eat you alive. You know, well, okay, let them try, but I'm here.
Challenge accepted.
Yeah, so my background actually has a lot of parallels with both of those. My dad wanted to be an architect when he was finishing up high school. He wanted to go to school for architecture, and he basically got nervous about the cost and about going into debt to finance this thing that he didn't know what, you know, his career was going to be like. And so he went to drafting school and became an architectural drafter. And he always kind of kept his old books at the house. And so I would read those and, you know, play around with all of his drafting equipment, which he had brought home after the mid 80s. Everything switched to CAD. And so he didn't need them anymore. So I played around with, you know, scales and triangles and dried up rapidograph pens and things like that. And yeah, eventually, and I also did a little bit of construction in high school as well. And so that was kind of my journey into it. I kind of knew that it was for me because I also am just, you know, nerd about math and geometry and all those things. And so, yeah, like, you know, the idea of doing other things, you know, has crossed my mind many times. And I actually went to urban planning school for a semester during the Great Recession when I thought that I was definitely going to get laid off, and wanted to do something with a little bit more social impact. And ultimately, I decided that that wasn't really for me. But yeah, I think, you know, that's one of the, I think, big challenges in architecture too, is trying to sell it to young folks of color who really want to make a change in the world. And I think we are really good at talking about the change that we want to make in terms of the environment, or in terms of making cities more vibrant and things of that nature. I don't think we're as good at talking about the change that we want to make in terms of justice, and particularly racial justice.
Well, and if you're not comfortable sharing this, please don't feel pressured, but I want to know if there was a low point in the journey. I mean, architecture, the path to licensure as an architect is hard, period. It's even harder if you're not encouraged along the way, or you're actively discouraged from pursuing it. So was there a low point that you, or a roadblock along the way that you faced where you thought, I don't know if I can do this? And how did you persevere through that? We're getting real.
Yeah.
That's a great question, actually. I'll go after you, ANNICIA.
I I mean, there's been multiple low points, Mike.
Mm.
I honestly don't, if I want to, you know, single out any specific one. There's some that, you know, for instance, you know, back in 2008, right, what happened with the, you know, sort of first recession, I think it was difficult for everyone. And, you know, sort of getting used to, you know, hearing of layoffs and all those kinds of things. But I'm trying to search for, you know, something a little bit more specific to me. Actually, what I'd like to share, Mike, was an experience that I had on the academic side, in terms of, you know, because it's all architecture related. And I've shared this with many of my colleagues already. I was tasked with, in one of my design studios I was teaching, I was tasked with coordinating the studios. Normally there are multiple studios and there's if it's a coordinated level, there is someone that leads that coordination. And I had an encounter with a student. And this is, you know, I'm telling the story to bring awareness to everyone on this call. It's not to single out anyone specifically, but I had a student when I, you know, entered the room and was, you know, introduced as the coordinator, who said to me, she said, "Oh, I didn't even know that we had a Black faculty here." And for me, that was a bit of a low point for me personally, because this wasn't a Black student saying this to me. This was actually, I mentioned this to FLORY before, this was a Latina student saying this to me. And if a Latina student can say that to me, you know, a Black faculty member, they sort of, you know, link into some sort of a, you know, a similarity there. But the thought that I had was, wow, is that the impression, right, that our students are having, or thinking, like, this isn't possible to see a Black faculty member in architecture? That was very hard hitting for me. And I think I thought about that the entire day. And, you know, at first, I think, Flora, you and I talked about, you know, whether the student was being a little smart or what, but in just sort of absorbing the comment, she was being so sincere by saying, "Oh, I did not think that this was possible." That's what I felt. And so that one always sticks with me, and it sort of came up again, you know, this just recently in other conversations. But I would say personally for me, that's one I'd like, you know, I can think of that I'd like to, you know, at least bring some awareness to.
Yeah. And I'm not wanting to dwell on the negative or bring up any memories that are hard to relive, but I just think people need to relate to the fact that this isn't a past tense issue. It's not, oh, this is something my grandparents dealt with or my mother dealt with. It's still part of the journey of people today.
And maybe if I could just add to that to Mike, to tell you, because I always love, you know, sort of overcoming stories, or just, you know, I always believe, like, you know, there's always good, right, that can come out of any situation. I was asked to speak, you know, as a Black faculty member at a summer program here. It was a girls empowerment program. And I remember the host asked me to just get up on stage and share my story. And these were kids that were no older than 10 or 11, boys and girls in the audience. And I told my story, you know, from growing up in Trinidad, being first introduced to the construction and design field. And when it was time for questions, you know, I opened up the floor and, you know, kids, they're a little quiet at first, but I saw this little hand go up and I couldn't even see the face. All I saw was the hand. And it was a young Black girl. When I was able, you know, to see who it was, young Black girl. She was maybe 6 or 7. And she said very firmly, Miss Street, my name is so and so. She stated her name. She said, I have been interested in architecture and design for a very long time. I've been trying to, you know, sort of figure out how I would even, you know, begin to talk about, you know, entering the field. This is a young girl, she's 6 or 7. And she said, I would like you to give me some advice on how I may approach my parents to tell them that this is what I'm interested in and what they can buy to prepare me for this field. I was flawed because even at that young age, she was searching, right, for just some, you know, some avenue of how she might even begin to just even talk about it, right? And for me, being there that day, just, you know, sort of telling my story, just being physical and present that day. And she was, you know, she was one of the only ones in that sort of a first question and answer that, you know, really felt, you know, had that bravery to get up and say, okay, I see you, and that's what I want to do. Tell me what I need to do to prepare. So that was, you know, a really sort of nice counter, you know, over, you know, sort of overcoming story to, okay, yes, I might be here. I might be the only one that you're seeing right now, but.
So thank you for sharing that. That's a great story. Anything else, Larry or Flory, before we, from the individual perspective, and then we've got some great questions that are more about the collective action that goes forward.
Yeah, so I would say that my low point came from this experience where there's this phenomenon that happens in the architecture industry, or actually many industries, but it's not, there's not a lot of awareness about it. But basically, you have a person of color that enters an organization. Everything's great at the beginning, and then because of things like unconscious bias, because of things like the way that you were raised, because of things of the lack of awareness of like what these little behaviors do to the person of color, we fall, unfortunately, into microaggressions. And so then the phenomenon is like the person comes in, everything's great, but then the microaggressions start. The person starts getting excluded out of the team. They feel like, you know, they're no longer invited to certain meetings. Just different behavioral things that happen when you have hypervisibility, when you are a token, when you are not part of the majority. And it's not the majority's fault. No one has that evil in their heart to make you feel excluded. It's just that they don't know any better. And so you're carrying this in your mind and in your head every day, and now you have to perform and work and still try to be part of this team with this trauma and this microaggressions building and building and building every day. And unfortunately, that makes a lot of people of color feel checked out mentally and not be able to feel engaged in their work anymore. And so unfortunately, I did go through that experience where my leaders saw that I was being checked out. And instead of coming to me and saying, hey, we've noticed that you are not as engaged, you're not checked out, you're distracted, what is going on and how can we do better because we value you? But instead, you know, unfortunately, it just ended up with them losing faith in my ability to be part of the organization. And I was devastated, you know, and I pleaded, I said, why can't we have a conversation about it? Why can't you help me be engaged? Why can't I share with you what you can do better? And I asked for awareness. I asked for compassion. I had actually suggested to one of the leaders, to one of the associates, diversity training because I'm getting treated differently. And I spoke from the bottom of my heart and I pleaded with this group. And unfortunately, it was met with a lot of resistance, a lot of denial, ignorance, awareness, unawareness. And it was so painful just to try to fight for something so hard. And me, myself, not knowing exactly what was happening, I've learned a lot since, thanks to that experience. I've educated myself in what happened. And just like kind of like the absolute apathy you know, and just the assumptions that I simply was not as good or not a good professional or unprofessional or simply not cut out for this. The words of my father came back to me. They're going to eat you alive. And it was a low point. I was discouraged. I was like, maybe I wasn't meant to be an architect. Maybe I should go back to just, you know, being a designer. And nothing against interior designers. I mean, they are incredible professionals. But I knew for me, my calling was architecture. However, experiences like what I just described it was a phenomenon that it just gutted me, you know what I mean? And I almost quit. I'm glad I didn't, but you were asking about low points, and that was certainly mine.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, I could share some various things, but I think in the interest of time, let's get into some Q&A. Sure.
Okay, I'll take them in order, and we'll some great questions. We'll get as many of them as we can. First one's from Avik Guha. How new is the Colorado chapter of the professional chapter of NOMA, and how can someone join or be more involved?
So we are going to be launching that chapter in the summer. We are submitting all of our paperwork to NOMA National, and we will be sharing a link to our website, and that is how you will be able to join. I believe the other person that was helping lead this panel, Mike, she asked me for further information and resources that she will be sending out after this, I believe.
Okay. I will make sure to note that before we end the conversation today, where you can find all those resources.
Okay.
Thanks. And the next one, for the panel, what are the actions that firms need to take both in the short-term and long-term timeframes in order to create change? Exposure to the profession and education access are identified issues we need to improve and change. What are tangible actions and improvements you advise firms to make now and in the future? How should we better engage our colleagues and communities directly in meaningful ways? There's a lot there. So I want to start with sort of building on your experience, FLORY, and making sure that this doesn't happen again, if at all possible. What about helping firm owners and managers and principals to be change agents in this process?
So I think, like I've been advocating for a while now, I think getting some education and some training into the firms as a requirement would be huge. I think it all starts with knowledge. It's being aware of what we're doing to each other. And I think that's where it starts, just diversity training. A lot of other industries require their teams to have diversity training. And right now in architecture, we do training for a lot of things, the Myers-Briggs, personalities, gender inclusion. But the one thing that we are not educating our peers on is race and cultural differences and microaggressions. So I think diversity training is 100% where we should start with that.
And if I can
in addition to that,
piggyback on that a little bit too, absolutely, yes, diversity training, unconscious bias training. And the AIA has produced, I think in 2018 and 2019, the Guides to Equitable Practice. That is a really fantastic document that has not just a bunch of, you know, here's what you can do, but also it has actual sort of vignettes of voices of people in the field and what their experiences have been, experiences like FLORY's, that help us to understand like what is behind all of this and why we need to change our cultures.
Got a question. Oh, sorry, I should have said that was from Ali Joyner. Thanks, Ali, for that question. Question from Frank Sturgill. There are 16 Black architects in Colorado out of 7,205 with a license here. Although I think a couple months ago we went up to 17. Every one of them counts. We don't want to leave anybody out. What is being done about the traditional roadblocks to licensure, including the ARE? Frank says, The ARE started coincidentally in 1965 and still includes the poll tax test method of all wrong answers and has no set passing score for each exam or definition of minimum competency as required by law.
Yep.
Is the ARE one of the traditional roadblocks to licensure, or is there something else that demands our effort and attention first before we deal with the ARE?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think it's tough for everybody. I think, you know, obviously it starts with even people getting the confidence to go to school. It does seem that in architecture undergrad programs, those programs have more racial diversity now than they ever have. And, you know, this is just me speaking about my opinion. I don't know about the pipeline component of it a ton, but I do know that there is a lot of fall off between students going from an undergrad, maybe a pre-professional architecture program, to getting into a professional program and getting on that path to licensure. And I think personally, if there were more 5-year bachelor's of architecture programs, which we, for example, don't have in Colorado, I think that could be a big help for a lot of, you know, students of color. It's a lot to have like a break and then feel like, okay, maybe I'll take some time and work or travel or something like that, and then try and get back into an education setting. And I mean, that's my personal experience. Was I have a pre-professional degree from the University of Colorado Boulder, and I intended to go to grad school. I went for a semester to planning school, but then I never went to graduate school for architecture, and I just got I was able to get licensed through working for, you know, like 8 years basically, to be able to get that equivalency.
Yeah, I think those options are declining as time goes on, though. I know that the ARE started as an alternate path to licensure for a lot of people who could not get into school or were so discouraged by the environment that they had in architecture schools that they were better off self-studying, teaching themselves how to take and pass the exam and getting the license that way. Or alternatively, finding a mentor in a firm who could help them gain that experience through that path to licensure. And now they're all sort of linked together. You can't do one
right
exclusively. You have to do all three. And so that's a heavy lift for anybody.
Yeah, and I do feel that experience is, you know, it works. Having gone through that myself, and I do think that there should be more opening to, I mean, it's still possible in some states like Colorado to get that through experience only. It's a huge amount of experience you have to do, but I think that's fair. But I think the fact that, you know, there's no reciprocity, at least automatically in the way there is through NCARB, if you go through the grad school plus, you know, 3 years of internship kind of thing. So that's, yeah, I think that's broadening the pathways to licensure, I think, just overall.
Got a comment from Tori Forrester I'd like your reaction to. The problem with this profession is that we are perceived to be elitist. We are assumed to be out of reach for much of the community. In the United States, we've done a disservice to ourselves on this, so the mountain we have to climb is high. Getting exposure to the community is one thing. Seeing value in what we do by others is another issue we have to deal with. Your thoughts on that? Is it a perception or is it reality that architecture is somewhat out of reach or elitist? I know Sam Mockbee said that, you know, he challenged architects not to be a house pet for the rich, you know, to extend their skills and talents to a lot more kinds of clients and community groups.
Mike, I think it's definitely a perception, and sometimes, most of the times, unfortunately, perception becomes reality in a sense. And so I think there's many avenues that we can start to address in terms of augmenting that perception, right? We know, whether it's both, whether it's on the academic side or the professional side, or just even from a community standpoint, understanding that no client has any, there may be scales of, projects that someone might work on, but there's some basic things that hold true, right? Architect to client, owner relationships, design team relationships, right? How we interact with each other sort of shows the value of how we might even interact with a client. I think that's very, very important. One of my mentors and principals at the firm that I am right now, he said something to me just regarding practice a few years ago. He said, we understand that this is a business, but at the core of it, we're people doing business with each other. So we have to be able to relate to each other on a sort of a basic, respectful human, sort of a level where we understand that we have something to give, right? And it doesn't matter how, where you sort of place that client, the size of the project, who you're actually designing for. There's value in every aspect of it. So I think the perception I believe it can be changed. I don't believe it lies solely, with a firm or a specific architect or entity or group. I think it needs to be a collective effort.
Sarah Goldblatt has a question. How can we support and engage locally with Tiffany Brown's 400 Forward initiative? And for anyone on the call who doesn't know what 400 Forward is, maybe you can explain. One of two of our 400 can explain what that is. So 400 Forward goes back to this notion that there are only 400 some, I think the number is now 478, African-American women who have ever been licensed as architects. So the initiative is to get to 500 and beyond. I believe Tiffany's in Detroit, if I remember right. But obviously this counts numbers across the nation. So is there anything we can do locally to support that?
To support Black women being licensed?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what? Okay. Yeah, I think what people can do, that's such a great question. Thank you so much. Is educate yourself in what things you might be doing that might be discouraging your Black colleagues, especially the females, and you may do or say something throughout the day that ruins her whole day, and then she can't deliver, her project on time. She misses the deadline. Now she, and this is not a particular example. This is just, hypothetically. And now, it just kind of like has that trickle effect. And now, she has a lower salary, doesn't get promotions. Eventually, this person will get discouraged, and they might leave the industry. You know what I mean? Let's say that they're now a mom and they are like, you know what? I don't want to juggle being a mom and being in this career that doesn't even want me there. So I think it starts from in our firms, how we treat each other, and just be very aware of the impact you might be having on the person that you would go next to you, because maybe some actions that you've been doing for a long time that you're unaware of will end up discouraging this person from being in this field, so that they never even pursue licensure. You know what I mean? So just encouraging each other, being mindful. I think that's what we can do kind of at the ground level, treating each other with that awareness, that respect, to encourage our fellow sisters to continue staying in the field and to become licensed. And that way we will stop dropping like flies. We will stay.
And Mike, I'd also like to add to that, just even knowing that there's support there. I had asked, questions of my colleagues, there's, when we want to, sort of promote something, for instance, like when I think about schools that are focused on STEM, right? There's usually events, where companies might go in and talk to the students about, careers in science or math or some sort of a field. I think each of us as an entity, and I'm going to hold, NOMA, AIA, Colorado speaking, to this, where we need to be more present, right? Within these institutions to just even bring that knowledge and awareness that the support is actually there. Something as simple as setting aside time to go and speak to, right, whether it's a group of students or in a firm or whatever entity it is. I think just knowing that the support is there can give you so much more of a boost in the possibility of getting to that final goal.
Well, we're at the hour mark, and I want to ask if you have time to take more questions, because we've got a lot of questions that people have, which is great. And for those who have to leave at 1, I'm going to ask Amy Dvorak, who's the co-chair of the EDI committee, if she might share in the chat where people on the call today can find further resources. We've developed a list of those for folks. I know some of the questions that came up in the Q&A were related to that, wanting to know what else is out there. And then for people who have to go, that's fine. We know you have other things. If you want to stick around, we're going to keep talking and keep asking questions. But before you leave, I just want to say, and I'll say this at the end, thank you to each of our panelists for having this conversation and for all you've done to advance the profession and stand up for yourselves as professionals in this career. And as a community, this is the start. This is by no means the end of the conversation. We have a lot more to do. So we hope you'll join us if you participated today in helping us to move that ball forward. Okay, so just a housekeeping note on that request I made to Amy, sorry. The list of resources will be in the AI Colorado newsletter tomorrow, not in the chat, in the newsletter tomorrow, so watch for that. Okay, so back to the questions. Ron Abo asks, as architects, where do you think you can have the greatest impact in terms of making our society more equitable and inclusive? 3 options he raises are: 1, bringing more awareness to the profession; 2, creating more opportunities for young people of color to enter the profession; or using your talents as designers to change communities. Or maybe all of the above.
Well, thank you, Ron. I know Ron very well. He's a member of our EDI committee and a personal mentor of mine. Yeah, absolutely. I think, the key, in my opinion, is that we just need to create more opportunities for more people of color to come into the profession. We are just so underrepresented, 6, 7, 8 times, we need that many more number of people to even reflect what our ratios are in society. And we're minorities in society already. And so I think that's super important, but I also think that, making people aware of the profession, I know that's something that Michelle Obama talked about at the AIA National Convention a couple of years ago. I think kids know what they know what the name architect is, but they don't know what that job is, and they don't know what really big impact that can have on society. And I think that if we make that more clear in a really direct way to, young Black and brown kids, then I think they're going to be excited about it. I was excited about it partly because I had some sense of that.
Rachel Baker has a question. What would be your advice for those of us fresh out of school that want to be active in addressing racial inequality in architecture? She notes that she's a Latina intern architect and don't feel yet that she has enough knowledge or experience to properly advocate within or outside her predominantly white firm.
Well, Rachel, that was her name, right?
Yes, Rachel Baker.
Okay. So, hi, Rachel. I'm a fellow Latina, and I've been in the industry for about 7 years. And I remember entering the field and being in my first job and like just feeling like this is so overwhelming, and I don't even know how to get involved or bring value. So I would say the best thing to do is kind of like recognize within yourself like what is special about you that you're bringing to that group. Because even though you don't have all the experience, there's something super unique about each individual that you can always bring to the table. You know, maybe if you're very intuitive in certain types of design, or you understand how people feel in certain environments. So don't let your lack of experience like discourage you from like speaking up or becoming a leader. Something that really helps is kind of like volunteer for a committee in your firm. So maybe you're not, you know, leading the projects yet, but maybe you can volunteer for, you know, to tutor like, you know, the younger kids at a middle school or something like that. Or if you guys have a group that you want to put together a presentation for like, yeah, sustainable design or something like that. That's something that I definitely did when I was younger. So just like use your time to volunteer for things related to architecture, but that bring kind of like that other perspective that they are things that a lot of times your manager will allow you to put in the timesheet, you know, and then you can gain experience of being a leader, of directing those things on the side. And that actually helps you grow your career and gain that much more knowledge, you know, and you can like bring speakers, you can connect people in the industry and bring them together, create those events. So I would definitely say volunteer in those extracurricular kind of committees within your firm. And I think that's a wonderful way to get involved as a young person, start kind of establishing yourself as that leader.
There's a great sort of concept out there about the different types of power. I think there's like 8 different types of power. And only a few of those are the types of power that we really think of, you know, the expert power and the power of, you know, a position or being experienced in a field. There is so much power in your personal experience, in the people that you know, and in the difference that you bring that other people in your firm, I promise you, do not know the things you know. And so, you know your power and work in it.
That's great.
We've got a question on AIA and what is AIA doing? In particular, Casey Taylor asked, what's the AIA doing to investigate reports of discrimination and prejudice? Is there any way, more questions coming in, it's moving the queue. Is there any way to report this? And if reported, will the AIA actually do anything about it? I can answer this one. In late 2018, the AIA nationally changed their code of ethics. It was mostly a response to the Me Too movement and some of the situations, the harassment that was taking place, sadly, in architecture firms. And they added to their code of ethics, and I can share this in the chat for folks who want to see this, that it is now a code of ethics and professional conduct complaint and a cause of action against any members who engage in harassment or discrimination in their professional activities on the basis of race, religion, national origin, age, disability, caregiver status, gender identity, or sexual orientation. So I think the code of ethics prior to that was effective, but it mostly dealt with business practices in relation to clients and consultants, and less about your relationship to the employee-employer relationship. So this was a big shift in a new direction, and it is used effectively. So if you know that there's a situation that exists where any of those things are happening on a discriminatory basis, there's a National Ethics Council that takes those complaints very seriously, and they will quite literally drum that person out of the profession. In some states, there are even rules that could put your license in jeopardy. And so that is something that we could look at as well as an advocacy agenda item, where if you are, if you have a proven hostile workplace environment, you probably should not be holding yourself out to the public as able to practice architecture. So those are a couple ways I would answer the question. I'm not the only voice on this though, so if our panelists have something to say, please do so. And in fact, FLORY, I know people are curious with your low point situation that you raised, did that firm eventually come around or change any of their practices?
No, unfortunately, not to my knowledge. But my hope is that now they might. Now that we all know a little bit more, maybe this will be great. This will help them gain some knowledge. I know it's helped me understand what happened. I think with knowledge comes power, right? So unfortunately, at that time, I don't think there was that awareness. I think there was very much that kind of like that feeling of denial, because no human being wants to feel like they're being a bad person. No one wants to feel like they're being unfair to someone or they're discriminating them. And I don't believe they're bad people. I just believe there was just a lack of awareness and a lack of education at the time. And so, yeah, it wasn't the ideal, but I have a lot of hope that moving forward, that firm and many other firms maybe can reflect back on some of the experiences that they've had and gain something from this and say, oh, maybe that's what's going on. And then maybe next time that some of these, things happen where, they see employees feeling disenfranchised, disengaged, excluded, then they can come at it with the right tools to address it and fix it.
Question from Drew Allen. It's about that time of year. We're a little past it, actually. What would you say to a young adult of color? Oh no, this was the graduate question. Sorry, I asked that earlier. So this is another question, somewhat a little further in people's life stage. What would you say to a young adult of color to nudge them towards a career in architecture and let them know that it is a viable and attainable career option? Mm-hmm. I'm sure you've all been asked that question individually from friends and family, and how have you answered that?
Yeah,
and hopefully it's not, my daughter went through this process, and with me working for AIA, I was really frustrated that most of the architects she expressed this interest to said, why would you do that? Or don't you want to make money? I mean, it was said in jest, but it is a little bit discouraging to people to hear that, oh, that's not something you want to do. I would imagine if you layer on some of the cultural and demographic constructs, it's even more discouraging to hear that. Mm-hmm. So how do we actively encourage people?
Mike, the first thing I want to say is, the issue of pay as well. I'm hoping, there's many other discussions, right, that come out of this. That is one of the biggest, sort of points you hear. And I, certainly heard that and heard other people, share those sentiments too. So hopefully there'll be another discussion on that as well. I think in circles that I have been, primarily in terms of the Black community, not having or the knowledge of knowing, what that path may look like, what resources are available, what particular steps need to be taken to be able to, sort of put yourself in that position to get ready, right, to study in the field is important. The other thing I was also going to say is, exposure to just knowing architects, of the world. Sometimes we default to a certain group. And I could speak for this, being on the academic side too as well. But, students and young adults need to know about architects of every level in terms of where they are in their career, what country they may be from, what race they may be of, whether they've done high profile projects, lower profile projects. They need to know about this, right? I remember one of the, first Black architects I met was David Auger. And he came to the University of Colorado a few years ago in our department to give a talk on, some of the work he was doing. And at that time, I remember I couldn't even quite get into the work he was doing because I was still on the fact that there's a Black architect in my department right now giving a talk on, the work that he's done. I hadn't seen that in years. Actually, I hadn't seen it at all. right? And so, and there's many more that we can list, right? There's some historical ones, but just even knowing that there's even more that we can share in terms of the variety of designers that are out there. I find that very, you know, sort of like needed in terms of allowing people or you know, students, young adults who are interested in the field to find their place, right? Find something they can align to and aspire to.
That's good.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think, you know, it was inspiring. I was already in architecture, but when David Adjaye came to Denver for the MCA competition, that was a really incredible moment in, you know, my seeing myself in another architect. And yeah, I think, you know, even just being frank about the challenges that there are, but also saying like, yeah, there's so much joy to have to get out of this. You know, it's a field where we're working a lot with, you know, really interesting technologies, and you know, but we're also it's very hands-on, and it's, you know, has a very like direct, real impact in the world. And I think, you know, there kind of aren't many substitutes for that kind of visible impact that you can have on the world. And you know, then, you know, not to get too sort of jokey about it, but it's like the aspect about money, which I have heard from many white architects. I mean, for I think a lot of us brown and black folks, the money is pretty good, you know, like it's all right. So yeah, like maybe that's sort of you know, a balancing factor.
Yeah. Okay, another question. We got just a few more. So this is Casey again. As a licensed female African-American architect in Colorado, I have experienced my share of discrimination and racism within my workspace. Some of it was very overt, some of it is very subtle. Both versions are exhausting. What will AI Colorado do to support me and people like me? How do I motivate my coworkers and employers to take on this fight with me? I'm going to pause right there because there's another question that is related to this from Caitlin Nunes, who says, piggybacking off FLORY's previous point, do you think it is your job to educate at the firm that speaks from a place of ignorance? I've been offended at the workplace, but have never spoken up. So two tracks on this inquiry. First of all, as an individual, how do you navigate that? What should you be expected to do if you're already feeling marginalized and diminished? And then organizationally, Larry, if you and I could maybe talk about what AI Colorado can help to support those people and back them up.
Yeah, I can take, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I believe you absolutely have to speak up. I understand that for some people that might take a little bit more, you know, sort of, you know, gathering of confidence and bravery to be able to do that, to be able to do that. But if we don't speak up, then it only perpetuates, the issue perpetuates. And you also have to be ready for, and I don't want to use the word consequences because there shouldn't be consequences for speaking up for something that you believe is unjust, right? But and there's ways to do it, right? It doesn't have to get confrontational or anything like that, but to sort of address it right there and then maybe that starts to open up even more avenues of conversations of something that have, you know, may have been, you know, systemic or reoccurring. I truly believe you have to strive to speak up right when it happens. And even if you didn't find the courage the first time, right, you can't allow the perpetuation to happen.
Yeah, and to build on that, I agree with ANNICIA, you do have to speak up. However, unfortunately, I think up until now, a lot of times speaking up can have those consequences, and then you are seen as, you know, making excuses, problematic, you know, stirring the pot, unfortunately. Leaders, they don't want problematic employees. And so if you're speaking up or sending an email saying, I feel discriminated, sometimes they just say, hey, let's add this to the list of problems with this person and dismiss them. So hopefully moving forward, this will change. But I think that, I think organizations like NOMA, if you're feeling discriminated, girl, join NOMA, because we are a safe space for you to come and share. And it's not a space for, you know, for like us to like, I don't know, kind of perpetuate like the divide or the hate. It's a space for healing and to equip you with the tools to how to deal with this situation. That's what I didn't have at the time. And that's what we are hoping to provide now to all the people that are feeling, is that we are going to come together as a group. We're going to educate ourselves, and hopefully we're going to start promoting diversity training to be required at all the firms. I'm hoping that happens in the near future. And then that way, if we are equipping ourselves with the tools to how to deal, and we are speaking up, and at the same time, the firms are receiving the training, and now they're aware of what's happening, and they know that it's not a problematic person or a cop-out, it's a reality, then maybe those two things together can make a way better option in how to resolve these things in the future.
Yeah, I think speaking to what the EDI committee in AIA is working on, you know, we are trying to promote a lot of tools for firms to really improve their cultures and understand how to be culturally competent, and yeah, to, you know, work through things around unconscious bias and all of that, and you know, intersectional biases for say, women of color in the field. I know is a really incredibly difficult role to have. And so, yeah, we are taking a lot of steps. It's an incredibly slow and long process. We can't go to firms and, you know, sort of force their hands to do things or force them to attend, you know, something, you know, that we're hosting. But yeah, and I think as well, you know, definitely, you know, join NOMA, and also, you know, get involved if you can with our EDI group. You know, we need as many voices of all the different experiences that we're trying to encapsulate to be present. So.
And I just wanted to quickly add, Larry, as you were speaking, it occurred to me that there is like this whole list, there's this entire vocabulary that we've been using during this discussion that you are familiar with, ANNICIA, you're familiar with, there might be some people listening that are familiar with, but the vast majority are not aware of what intersectional bias is, or unconscious bias, or hyperboostability, or tokenism, or microaggressions. Like, there is so much education that we still need to implement in our industry, because we're here talking about this topic, and, you know, I'm getting messages on the side, what do you mean by hypervisibility, you know? And so I think even learning the vocabulary to be able to talk to each other and understand what we mean is a huge step, and it's a huge gap that we have right now in our culture.
Yeah, so add that to all your ARCA speak. You got to learn these terms too.
Yeah.
Well,
no pressure.
If I could add to some of the comments directly to Casey and Caitlin, and with full acknowledgement that I'm an imperfect messenger, right? Because if somebody like me goes to a boss, it's going to be received differently than if you two do it. First is, don't assume that you're the only one who is affected by it. You know, bad behavior manifests itself across an organization, so there are probably other people who are on the receiving end of that. So you may not, and probably are not, facing this challenge alone. So find some allies and ask if they can join you in supporting you, even if they aren't as negatively affected. They might be willing to be with you when that conversation happens. And then we had a very similar conversation with this at a program we did in Illinois with Harvey Gant. And Harvey was the first African-American student of any major to integrate Clemson University. He was an architect in Charlotte, North Carolina, and became mayor of Charlotte. So he said to the person who asked this question, and he gave some advice that we've all talked about here in the last 2 or 3 minutes. But then he ended with, if you don't see change, you need to leave. Do not put yourself in a situation where you are going to continue to be diminished and where they are not listening to you. Even if you don't have another job lined up, you need to find a better place to work. You cannot be expected to change that whole place by yourself. And if that's what you're facing, just get out.
Yeah.
So I know that's not an encouraging message, but it's a realistic message.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
If I've said anything wrong,
That's a
then
great
correct
point.
me on that.
No, totally.
No, that's great.
And I think it speaks to just, there with all of this, it's like, we're really rushing to try to understand, okay, what can we do? What are the answers? And it's really complicated. People are working in places that have, personalities that are difficult, or, their livelihood depends on it. And this is slow work, and it's hard work.
Mhm. So a couple more as we start to wind down here. Moving forward, what benchmarks might be used to measure the AI organization and the profession's progress toward a more diverse workforce? That comes from Adam Bunce.
Well, one thing I think we really need to have happen, which is something that we discovered trying to do some looking at demographics in Colorado, is that we need to get the Department of Regulatory Affairs to start collecting data on, the race and ethnicity of licensed architects. We don't have that benchmark information, and we can really only kind of look at like AIA numbers and NCARB numbers to kind of get a rough picture of what it looks like. But the more data we have, the better. The good news is that AIA and NCARB are both collecting data, and so we have benchmarks and we're seeing it.
Yeah, the shortcoming there though, Larry, not to interrupt, but it's voluntary data. You don't have to report it. And not everybody has an NCARB certificate, and not everybody who's licensed is going to be an AIA. So it's part of the picture. It's better than nothing, but it's not the full picture. And if DORA were to require it, then that's everything. That tells us exactly where we are and how far we need to go.
Mm-hmm.
What about on the academic side, ANNICIA? Do you feel that there's good data there, if you know anything about it at that level?
I don't have specific numbers in front of me right now, but I can speak to what I've seen in terms of progression over the last 4 or 5 years. The one thing I did want to state specifically, the College of Architecture and Planning, I'm not sure how many people were aware of this, but for many years, the architecture program was a solely, a graduate architecture program, but we now offer an undergraduate degree as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we have seen tremendous growth in that program, not just in terms of the amount of students that are in the program, but the amount of minority students that have, entered that program. And maybe it's something that, I could speak to, sort of leaders in the department in terms of maybe making that information a bit more public, even beyond the, the walls of the institution, so that we all collectively as a profession would have some semblance of, sort of what's to come, and understand if we're actually doing a really good collective job of, sort of encouraging students to essentially enter and progress through the field. Because I for me, myself, I see it, so I have an understanding of it, but maybe being able to see the actual data a little bit more directly could, bring even more awareness to everyone in the field.
Okay, just two more questions. So the first one I'm going to direct to Larry, comes from Adam. What is the EDI committee doing to achieve its mission other than the tasks already at hand? Continued research into short and long-term recommendations to the AI board, firm outreach, EDI integration into AI color programs, creation of resources for members.
So what are we doing other than what are we doing?
Well, what are some things that we are thinking about for the future that we're trying to sort out where we go?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we have talked about particularly is trying to get HSW credits for EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion content. That's, I think, one of the big ones that we have really made a commitment in our most recent meeting to push for. Mike, sorry to throw this back on you, but
Yeah.
Can you help me out a little bit here? I'm a little
Sure. We had a great call yesterday, by the way, with the committee, and that committee, if you want to get more involved, meets every month. And we do have a long list of, I think it was over 18, past, present, and future ideas that we're looking at. So rather than read all of them, know that we're actively engaging in how to keep moving the ball forward. I think a lot of them have to do with taking the arenas where we already have a presence and where we have a strength. If it's talking to members and firms, providing continuing education and training opportunities, dealing with the legislature and regulatory departments as our advocacy role. So it's basically saying, what are we already doing as an organization, and how can we weave justice into those objectives and those deliverables that we do today, but just raise it to a whole other level with this as not only a lens to prioritize the efforts and the resources, but as a long-term goal. It's that old saying of the arc of justice, or the arc of history bends toward justice. Well, it only does if you're pulling it in that direction. So it's not enough to say, well, I'm not actively practicing injustice, so
yep.
good. Get on the thing
Exactly.
and bend it in the right direction.
Yes. Yes.
And
like
you don't
it.
have to do anything new. You just need to keep doing what you're already good at and thinking of how justice impacts those efforts that you're good at doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that's not a specific answer where I can do bullet points, but those bullet points do exist of, we are looking at doing this.
Yeah, and I also just thought of one quick thing too, is that there is now, the state is in the process of looking at doing what they call a disparity study that will hopefully help lead to the creation of a minority and women-owned business enterprise procurement system, which is like the federal system, which grants a certain amount of any federal contract has to be through minority and women-owned businesses. The state is looking at potentially doing that. They're taking the steps to get to that place. And the city of Denver also has a similar program existing. And so those kinds of things really do legitimately help support businesses owned by people of color. So, and we're looking at what we can do as part of that.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to ask sort of a question about what we've seen in the last week from companies and other organizations issuing statements. How are those hitting you? Your perception of either companies, corporations, organizations like ours, firms. Do those have value? And I know there's a concept of greenwashing where people will have their, burnish their credentials of sustainability, for example. But if they don't back it up, it doesn't mean a lot. Are we at risk of engaging in I don't know if blackwashing is a thing, but is there something that we might be inadvertently doing without backing it up with action? So do the statements help? And how do we put legs on the statement to show that we mean what we say?
I think you have to show what you mean in itself.
There's a reason they called it show and tell in school.
Show and tell. It's funny you said that, Mike. At the when my class transitioned to Studio Online, we sort of impromptu, it was sort of an impromptu thing at the end of one session. One day I said, okay, it's time for show and tell. Right now it was everyone's first time being online, and I saw all sorts of things. I saw all the animals, all the that's a whole other discussion. But no, you have to act on it. I just sort of caught one of the last comments here from Gina DeMatteo, if you'd allow me. Yeah, she mentioned something about firm leaders also being held accountable, and I'm going to speak to any type of leadership, right? If it's seen at that level, I think that's a sure way to start to lead by example, right? Show and tell, what you're really meaning to do in terms of action. I don't want to make it any sort of a philosophical, any sort of a deep answer where it has to be, these 3 things or these 4 things. We just need to mean what you say and do it, do the action, do the work.
Yeah, to build on what you just said, ANNICIA, we have seen a lot of statements recently, and there is a lot of talk, right? Like what we're doing right now. And that's good. That's great. I do think there's value to all the statements that you see in our organization, because it's a courageous thing to do. You see them kind of like stand up and like say, yeah, I support this, and kind of like acknowledge. And the more voices that acknowledge, the stronger the message is that this is a reality and not just something made up. So there's a ton of value in that. But like ANNICIA said, after we have all this talk, let's take some action. And I hope that this momentum doesn't get lost, you guys. I hope that this is not just something that will fade and then everybody will like calm down and go back to like, the more normal way that we do things. I do hope that we, like Larry was mentioning, start all educating ourselves, with all of these amazing resources and tools that are out there. I hope that, like Casey mentioned in one of the comments I saw, that the AIA does start requiring more diversity training, because it is crucial. So I think that should be part of being a licensed architect, is like knowing how to interact and being aware of how you're acting with other cultures, not only your colleagues, but also what about your clients as well, So I do think that this is all great, and there's a lot of value to it. But like ANNICIA said, let's take some action to educate ourselves and to require some accountabilities from this firm for them to undergo this kind of education.
Yeah, I think there's a statement that your budget is your policy, and I think for firms, putting your money where your mouth is after you've made these statements, invest in unconscious bias training for your C-suite, for your senior employees, for all of your employees if you can afford it. And it's COVID, it's tough times, but this is a really, really important issue. And if we don't see serious resources going to it, we're not really going to see change.
There's a saying I've heard that if you want to see what someone values, look at their credit card statement. Right.
That's so accurate.
Yeah. Well, the question, or really more of a last word I want to let you guys end on is, and I'll give you some time to think about it while we do some wrap-up announcements, is what is one thing that you would tell people to do to change things now? That could be done on an individual level, because obviously there's a great amount of interest in this. Like I said at the top of the call, huge level of participation, people wouldn't be here spending an hour and 40 some minutes talking about it if they didn't care. So for people who do care, what is one thing they can do in the short term, like right now, just to be a force for change? But while you're thinking about that, I do want to say, we've got some things queued up. Again, this is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of addressing this in meaningful ways. We're looking at doing intercultural competency training in July. That is because the board has set as one of their, we're in the process of developing a new strategic plan. We know that 3 of our imperatives for this year and in the future are environmental stewardship, a culture of belonging, and justice, equity, diversity, and inclusiveness. So I think they're all 3 related, even though they're distinct topics. But we are going to devote, we're going to put some debts on our credit card around each of those 3 items, devoting staff time, volunteer time, and dollars to addressing those in the future. And I also have to say, you know, we have had an imperfect history here. We're a little bit late to the party, but we are here and we're ready to get rolling. So take us for what we can give, and we're sorry if we haven't done a good job living into those values before, but we are doing our best now. There's a statement that I heard from somebody very early on. He was a mentor to me, a self-taught architect who really helped lead the NOMA organization in Illinois. And he would tell people who said that, you know, AIA is just a boys club, or it's a bunch of elitists, or you don't want to be part of that. He would tell his colleagues from the minority community, the best way to kick the dents out of the can is from the inside. So we welcome anyone with a steel-toed boot and a strong leg to come in the can and kick the hell out of it with us. So with that, what's one thing that you would advise or encourage people to do to make change now?
If I can start, guys. The one thing I do want to call attention to, you know, we're thinking about what has happened, right, in these last few days, weeks, and how, you know, however we want to quantify it, but realize that it's still very present. And I say that because up until even this morning, I read an article where a young woman in South Africa was murdered, and not just murdered, but was hung from a tree, right? That was reported this morning, and we're talking about events in the last couple of weeks, and so it's ever present. That's the word that I want, you know, everyone to be thinking. So I want everyone to be ever present as well in their you know, sort of a willingness to be an ally in terms of addressing or looking for ways in how you might, you know, sort of contribute and address, right, this cause right now. Something as simple as we've talked about educating yourself. But if we're talking about just simply engaging with someone from the Black community, you may have never even had Black friends. You have to be able to understand that that person is also human. We bleed the same blood. We bleed, you know, red blood. We're same. And you might be met with some, you know, some people may sort of respond differently because time, you know, everything right now is so charged, emotionally charged.
Mm-hmm.
You can't get discouraged. You can't be, you might feel disappointed, but you can't be discouraged. You have to understand that there are a number of factors that are playing into what we're addressing now, and it needs to be an ever-present, ongoing effort. I'd really like just to make sure that I emphasize that.
Yeah, I appreciate that because we have a history of having a short attention span. We tend to move on to the next crisis, and this has been to our disservice for the last several decades. It hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
So I think what I would say is I just want to kind of like give you a little more insight into my perspective, is that I have two sons and they are half white. And I have a lot of friends and family that are of the American culture. So I have a long history of having very close, intimate relationships with those that are considered of the majority. And I understand a lot of the struggle comes from the lack of awareness of knowing that what you're doing may be right or wrong. So I would say the one thing that people can do, the best thing that you can do right now today, is take a breath and take a moment to look within yourself and analyze yourself. It all starts inside of us, and think, if there are things in my upbringing, if there are things in my environment that I was brought up in that caused me to unconsciously look at people of other races, Black people specifically, or other mixed minorities, as less than me. Like, I know that's a tough question, you guys. I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad, but we're talking about the tough topics, right? So here's the reality. Do you feel superior in some kind of unconscious way through no fault of your own, simply by the experiences you've had and by the upbringing you've had? And so I think asking yourself that really tough question is the step number one that you can do to kind of start catching yourself treating minorities. Maybe you are treating minorities a little bit differently. Maybe it's so subtle that you don't even notice, but trust me, they feel it. So I think having that awareness, looking within yourself, your family, your upbringing, your personal life, and seeing how are you acting every day? Are you acting the same to everyone? Are you treating everybody equally, truly? So I think, and you don't have to share that with anyone. That's your own personal kind of reflection. But I think that would be my advice, is look within you and start becoming self-aware of your own self. And I think it starts there.
Good advice.
Yeah, I think the thing I would say, I've been really amazed at how willing and passionate so many people, white people specifically, have been around coming out and being supportive and making, really strong statements that I would not have heard in, even recent years. And I think within that, and within all the future action that, we're taking together, to think about who any action is centering. Is it centering Black people, brown people, people who have been marginalized? Or is it centering yourself? Is it centering your interest in maybe, your company being perceived in a certain way? Or
Right.
Are you really in the fight with us?
Mm-hmm.
Well, those are great. We've had a series of great thoughts and tremendous insight, and those were great ones to end on. ANNICIA, FLORY, Larry, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today. We're so grateful for all the participants who could take time out of their very busy week to have this conversation with us. And now it's action time. Continue to have conversations individually and with groups and within your networks of influence about what you can do, and join us, join NOMA in taking the next step forward to actually see change and movement.
Mm-hmm. And thank you to you, Mike and Megan and Amy.
Thank you. Yes.
And I know everyone, Flori and Larry share, sort of the same appreciation for just being able to have the platform to speak, but to speak directly and, from the heart in terms of exactly what we'd like everyone to know. And I hope the conversation continues.
Yeah, thank you, ANNICIA and FLORY, for joining us on short notice, and thanks, Mike, for really making this happen.
It's our pleasure, and we hope to do more of it. And on that note, tomorrow at noon, we have a conversation with the School of Architecture on how architecture education is changing in response to COVID, and some of the impacts it's having, in particular on non-traditional students who may be most affected by this new remote learning environment and how it's going to change in the future. And we look forward to doing a lot more together It's a long journey, but we have to take the steps, and we're grateful that we could have this conversation with you, and we hope that more people come and join us along the way. So thank you very much again, everybody who joined us. And again, resources will be available, announced in our newsletter tomorrow on our website. And then for this conversation, if you'd like to review it in whole or in part, we will be making that available as a recording. And then we'll be taking smaller portions of it as well. So if you were inspired by this conversation and know someone else who could get some particular wisdom out of a piece of it, we encourage you to share that when it comes out. So if you have a particular thing you would like to see us capture and record, please reach out to anyone on AI Colorado staff, and we'll make sure that that gets packaged for your use as we expand the audience and expand the number of allies and stakeholders who are in this together. Thank you for letting us have this conversation and for being so honest and transparent. And we hope to do it again soon.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Mhm.
Take care, everyone.